Today I'm presenting a paper which we co-authored together with Professor Dariusz Wójcik, which essentially takes a deep dive into the investment bank's practices in relation to sustainability transition. I realize that the title sorts of give away the gist of our findings, but I wish to just start with providing a little bit of context about our research project. In particular, share a few words on the genesis of the paper as a piece of scholarship and where it might fit in current developments in sustainable finance. I will then present the empirics, briefly giving you a bit of an overview of the findings, but then sort of, I think, try and accelerate a little bit and discuss the implications, thinking about the implication for sustainable finance as a movement, scholarship and practice, and also discuss the implications for the banking sector and more specifically asset owners and try and find some relationships there. And finally, I will leave you with some concluding remarks and especially a suggestion for possible avenues for future research on related questions. So in terms of context and maybe looking at one particular piece of scholarship, so in 2006, Professor Schultens published a now well-cited paper titled Finance as a Driver of Corporate Social Responsibility. And I think in this paper, there's two essential points. The first one, which is not original, we might have heard it a lot during this conference as well, but I think really deserves to be emphasize is really about the transformational power of finance and how finance can actually influence firm-level sustainability. And the second one, which is more a specific criticism towards a lack of engagement with sustainability in primary markets. In the paper, Schultens focused particularly on corporate lending, basically making the argument that this is the primary source of finance and new finance for non-financial corporations. Now, admittedly, this has somewhat improved over the last decade, and there's more engagement from banks on that particular issue. But on the other hand, we find very little engagement both from practitioners and also scholarship on underwriting, which actually is a core primary market activity. So arguably, more than a decade later, I think some of his observations stand. So we see that institutional investors and increasingly retail investors demand investment solutions that meet certain social and environmental standards. So in 2018, the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance estimated the global market for sustainable investing assets to have reached $30.7 trillion. The sector grows also at a remarkable pace. Their study for 2018 shows a 34% growth in the last 2 years, or between 2016 and 2018. Now, investment products and services labeled ESG, SRI, and other kind of declinations have almost become ubiquitous, and one would be hard-pressed to find financial companies that, with an asset management arm, that don't have investment funds and services labeled as sustainable. And on the other hand, the companies responsible for issuing new finance in the form of corporate loans and debt and equity emissions have been relatively slow and timid adopters of the principles underpinning sustainable development. Interestingly, in the last 2 or 3 years, we're starting to see a number of actors starting to cherry-pick particularly contentious issues, usually environmental over social ones, and publicly announced their intention to alter their lending practices in particular. There are many examples which we'll review in more detail in the paper, but just for illustration purposes, I've just used a couple of news media announcements. And interestingly, these initiatives come at a time where large financial companies are also increasingly guilty of offering products and services simultaneously pulling in opposite directions. It's not unusual for a single firm to retail fossil-free investment funds in its to its asset management clients, and yet make substantial loans to companies active in tar sands, coal, and Arctic drilling. There's a very good report on that particular issue written by a consortium of NGOs. Now, Maybe marking a turning point for the sector, the United Nations has announced the launch of the Principles for Responsible Banking for the end of 2019. The intention is to bring together industry leaders to develop firm-wide policies to align the business practices with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. This will, of course, present significant challenges, especially to those large financial conglomerates that operate under the same roof, diverse activities, including retail banking, wealth and asset management, corporate lending, underwriting, and M&A activities. And, of course, the question of how to apply sustainable development goals across these activities presents different sets of challenges. Now, while the future of responsible banking is somewhat uncertain, we were curious to take an empirical look at its more recent past. And since underwriting has received little to no scholarly attention, we decided to take a closer look at the sector and ask if and how investment banks might integrate sustainability in their underwriting services. Now, to briefly cover the methods, as a starting point, we used the list of 153 blacklisted companies available from Norges Bank Investment Management, which is the company responsible for the management of the government pension fund Global, Norway's sovereign wealth fund. We used the list to filter through close to 500,000 debt and equity underwriting deals sourced from Dealogic. And our study covers 13 years starting in 2005, which was the first exclusion made by the GPFG, and ends in 2017, which was the latest data point available when we ran the analysis. By using this list of excluded companies, we effectively piggyback on the work done by the Ethics Council, which is the independent body responsible to review cases of corporate malfeasance, which are essentially deemed too problematic to warrant active engagement, and as a result are excluded from the fund's investment universe. We acknowledge that the criteria used to determine which companies deserve to be on that list is not perfect, but we think that it provides a decent starting point to begin an analysis and a conversation on the issue. In particular, it sets a reasonable threshold for corporate malfeasance and is exposed relatively publicly, especially given the high visibility of the GPFG. Now, in terms of what these exclusions actually entail, so it consists of two broad categories, one which is conduct-based exclusion and the other one product-based exclusion. Conduct-based exclusions results from misbehaviors which have been well researched and documented by the Ethics Council. There's also quite a lot of evidence of the issues they point out from third parties, including NGOs. These conduct-based exclusions entail a number of subcategories. You see them here. These include severe environmental damage and violations of human rights. Our approach is to flag any underwriting deal involving a company listed for conduct-based exclusion after the exclusion date. So we assume that the exclusion date and that moment is a turning point at making the issue quite, public. And the timing of product-based exclusion is somewhat more arbitrary. So nuclear weapons and cluster munitions have been banned since 2005. Tobacco, on the other hand, was blacklisted in 2010 and coal in 2016. So we take a slightly different approach for the product-based exclusion and flag all the underwriting deals involving those companies from 2005 onwards. We take this approach because we make the assumption that the evidence on the negative social and environmental effects of tobacco and coal were established at the very least from 2005 onwards. As you can see here, the approach also has the advantage of smoothing the sample size through time. So they're just comparing when the companies were blacklisted according to the Ethics Council and our adjusted sample with the method I just described. Now, looking at some of the core findings. So there's quite a lot of information there, but I'll try and focus on two main points. At an aggregated level, first, the total money that was raised by the companies blacklisted by the GPFG represents a fairly small but growing share of the total. Now, obviously, this is a product of the methods that we use. The more companies you include in the sample, the larger the share as well. Specifically, it's a total of $762 billion that were raised for blacklisted companies. Now, this accounts for just under 1%, to be precise, 0.83% of the total equity and debt capital raised over the period. And secondly, the deals generated $6.2 billion in net revenues for participating banks. Now, this roughly accounts for 1.2% of the net revenues for banks participating in underwriting over the period. Now, if we zoom in on the example of coal, you can see that the total capital emitted over the period has been quite significant. That's $279 billion raised, and that the new debt and equity capital raised over the period has also been growing quite significantly. Now, we don't have conclusive evidence of this, but our hypothesis is that it's possible that the gradual lending squeeze imposed by banks on coal companies might effectively be pushing coal companies to turn to capital markets to raise money. If this were to be true, it would highlight the necessity for banks to actually have consistent practices across their activities. In total, these debt and equity underwriting deals have generated $2.76 billion in net revenues for participating banks. Now, while it sounds like a sizable dollar amount, it actually only represents 50 basis points of banks' net revenues over the period, and I'll come back to why that might matter. Providing banks find just enough resistance and potentially the right kind of incentives as well, giving up on some of these activities, and coal would be potentially a good place to start, would be a relatively small concession to make. Now turning to some of the implications and thinking about how we can address the issue. So we were curious to explore what that might actually mean for investors interested in sustainability. And so we decided to first turn to the equity portfolio of the GPFG and see if we would retrieve the banks that underwrite the debt and equity of the companies the fund tries to stay away from. And so we found that out of $169 billion invested in financial companies, 30 billion were effectively invested in banks that service the companies blacklisted by the fund. Now, considering that the GPFG has a sizable active management operation, we think that there is real potential for them, as well as other institutional investors and asset owners in particular, to start engaging banks on their underwriting practices. Perhaps one strategy would be to start with specifically targeted issues, and as I just mentioned, coal could be a decent place to start, especially making this argument that it is actually a small concession to make as far as revenues are concerned. So to conclude, we think that banks are too important actors to be neglected in this discussion in sustainable finance. Although asset management is showing promising results in promoting a transition towards sustainable finance, sustainability principles should really be integrated in the negotiation of new finance. And banks are centrally positioned to do exactly that. Every year, investment banks underwrite close to $7 trillion of new finance. And so where and how this money flows is fundamental in terms of approaching questions of sustainable development goals. Although high-level initiatives such as the UN Principles for Responsible Banking offer interesting avenues for promoting better practices, we really think that asset owners also have a role to play in this discussion. In particular, if only to be consistent with their sustainable investment practices, asset owners ought to demand better transparency as well as more consistent standards from the banks they invest in. Moving forward, we also suggest that ESG rating agencies should really rethink the way they assess the sustainability of financial intermediaries and try and put a greater emphasis on the underlying sustainability of the companies they help finance. And I'll leave it to that. Thank you very much.